where you are in Canada, you're on native land. From Nova Scotia to British Columbia, this is all illegally occupied Native American, or rather First Nations, territory. And in Canada, there's over 634 registered bands. In Canada, we use the term First Nations to denote Native American or Indigenous people, but this term is not interchangeable or usable in the United States. This term specifically refers to Native people that are not Métis or Inuit. And just like in the United States, many of the tribal names that you might be familiar with are actually Anglicized or even Frenchified because it is Canada, different from how nations and the people would actually call themselves. For example, you may know the Iroquois, also known as the Haudenosaunee, which has 6 nations underneath it: the Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, Oneida, Onondaga, and Tuscarora. But even those terms are not always what the tribes call themselves. For example, Mohawk would be Goniagehaga. And the reason why the term Iroquois is used is because the French adopted a word from the Algonquin, and that word actually means like black snake or rattlesnake, which is very insulting. The sneak diss from natives is just legendary, and historically so. You can also see this with nations like the Cree, which is a term that the French adopted from the Ojibwe, and the word sounded like Cristinos, something like that, but they actually call themselves this. And I mentioned the Ojibwe, but did you know that they're actually known as the Anishinaabe? In fact, most native names that you may be familiar with are not using the native language from those groups of people. If you look at this map behind me, you can see a comprehensive list of native nations in their native names. Now in Canada, it's a little bit better when it comes to education on First Nations individuals. You do see it pop up sometimes in the classroom, depending on where you're located. But just like the United States, Canada tends to ignore its native and Indigenous populations in the classroom, in the decision-making, in the boardrooms, which doesn't make much sense considering Native American people make up 5% of the population in Canada versus the 1 to 2% that they do in the United States. But regardless, no matter where you are in Canada, you are on native land. Illegally occupied, broken treaty, native land.
See how she likes to use the term First Nations and not Aboriginal or Indian? So this is a book called Entitlement to the Indian Status and Membership Codes in Canada. Algonquin Indian from Ontario, and as an Aboriginal person who has lived and worked outside of the Aboriginal community all my life, I am actually aware of the identity crisis suffered by many Aboriginal people separated from their homelands, their tribe or clan, their language, and their culture. Seeking and protecting one's identity is a personal and very human aspiration. It is seldom that the state intervenes and declares persons are not who they really are. That is the legacy and the reality of the Indian Act. The laws of entitlement to treaty is not the Indian Act. There are many parts of Canada where treaties do not exist. And yet, as treaty talks began as early as the 17th century, Indian status was never and should now not be the test for admission into treaty and vice versa. From the beginning of treaty making in Canada, First Nations have assumed the right to determine who is treaty according to the customs of those people. Unlike Indian status, treaty entitlement rules flow from the applicant. Objective connection to treaty and treaty itself. So basically, these First Nations people up in Canada, well, my bad. These natives, Siberian people up there, basically they formed their own government. And see how they say First Nations, then it says unlike Indian status. First Nations and bands. The term First Nation is a recent phenomenon in our language. Its origin is not so recent. The words reflect a reality which the government of Canada once recognized in negotiating treaties, but has since forgotten. Connected to that reality is the term Aboriginal peoples, which has become popular in Canada in part because it is actually defined in subsection 35(2) of the Constitution Act 1982 as including the Indian, Inuit, Métis people of Canada. A First Nation includes an Indian Act band, but may also refer to individuals who do not belong to Indian Act bands. The Aboriginal people of Canada are the citizens of the First Nations. And a lot of these natives do not like to use the term Indian or Aboriginal, just First Nation. And see, they go off by a band, not a tribe. I'm going to read a few parts of this source. After the number of treaties were signed in the West, Indian Affairs in Ottawa became an increasingly more important agency of the federal government. In 1880, the Department of Indian Affairs were formally created but still operated under the authority of the Minister of Interior, who held the title Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. This is the period in which Indian agents became an important, if not the most influential, element of Indian affairs. Agents were charged with managing Indians and Indian lands. They were given statutory powers over the chiefs and council, made justice of the peace, and given the power to sentence Indians who stepped out of line. The Indian Act, or similar legislation as it relates to entitlement, or more simply put, who is an Indian, has been amended repeatedly for more than 150 years. Many of these amendments were bold attempts at reducing the Aboriginal population of a province or the whole country. Many of the amendments changed the way of the government defines an Indian. The historical account of the Indian Act is indispensable in determining the issue of entitlement when the applicant's family history does not include any ancestors who were recorded as band members. And see how in 1880 the Department of Indian Affairs was created. They had Indian agents sent out different parts of Canada, documenting us. And it says right here, reducing the Aboriginal population of a province or a whole country. Either a lot of us Indians, a lot of us were sellouts, or, these natives created this department or organization just to wipe us out. Or they side with the YT people. This is a picture of Iroquois Indians of Canada. He got the feathers, the rifle. They're melanated. They're the real Aboriginals of Canada. First Nations and bands. The term First Nation is a recent phenomenon in our language. Its origin is not so recent. The words reflect a reality which the government of Canada once recognized in negotiating treaties, but has since forgotten. Connected to that reality is the term Aboriginal peoples, which has become popular in Canada in part because it is actually defined in subsection 35(2) of the Constitution Act 1982 as including the Indian, Inuit, Métis people of Canada. A First Nation includes an Indian Act band, but may also refer to individuals who do not belong to Indian Act bands. The Aboriginal people of Canada are the citizens of the First Nations. Another image of women of the Snake tribe, and they are Cree. This is a Iroquois warrior of Canada. And you know what's weird? You got these Native Americans, a lot of them dress the same at the powwows. They do the two-step. They have teepees. And that's another thing. These people were teepee travelers. They pick up the teepees and then they traveled around. And then they squatted here on the mainland. These are pictures of Siberians wearing the headdress. And these Native Americans are wearing the exact same thing. A look at the picture in the middle, the picture down on the bottom right. They're the same group of people. These people are not the originals here. Picture of a Ojibwe woman. And this source describes the Aboriginal race, describes the Mongolian, the American Indian, and African. These are copper-colored Ojibways. To end things off, the Canadian government, they reclassified the Aboriginal people. We lost our language, our tribe, our traditions, our lands. They obviously did a destiny swap with the natives. Now you see them claim Algonquin, Ojibwe, and they're not the real Ojibways. Definitely not. And a lot of the Indians had wars against these people as well. But with Canada's history, it caused an identity crisis. And my thing is this, I feel like with all the wars happening, reclassification up in Canada, they pushed us down here on the mainland. That's the way I see it. But I hope you guys like it, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.